Hello guys, welcome to PA Talks episode 3. This episode of PA Talks is with Ferda Kolatan. Ferda Kolatan is an associate professor of practice at the University of Pennsylvania. I hope you will get the most out of this interview. Dear Ferda, thanks for being at GAD Foundation for an interview. This interview is organized and sponsored by GAD Foundation and Parametric Architecture magazine. We invited you here to ask a couple of questions about your academic and work experience in architecture. You are an associate professor of practice at the University of Pennsylvania, and you have lectured on many leading architecture schools in different countries. Also, you have your own architecture practice, which is called SU11. So I'd like to pass the mic to Gökhan Avcıoğlu. He will start with a couple of questions from his own, and then I will jump into my questions and continue our interview. Thank you. Dear Gökhan.
Especially the first question about your teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Already you invited Istanbul with your studios and your students also. And what happened in Istanbul? What did you do? What is your first impression, last impression about Istanbul, your site and your students? Approximately 13 students,
yes.
right?
Yes. So, well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. The studio we took from the University of Pennsylvania is the final year of the graduate program at the School of Architecture. And we took 13 students to Istanbul just last week. They have already returned. And the focus was an area which is called Tophane, and it's adjacent to a large development that is ongoing as we speak, which is the Galata Port. And the Galata Port has been a very important site politically, as well as in terms of its history and its meaning to contemporary Istanbul. It used to be the terminal for large cruise liners, and it's being renovated as we speak. The Istanbul Modern, which is the Modern Museum of Istanbul, used to be located on the site. It has been taken down. A new building will be built. They will move back. So it's a very important site, and that site is being developed, as I said, as we speak. Our interest was not to look directly on that site, but understand how that new site is going to be connecting back to the city. The Galata Port site is flanked by 3 different neighborhoods, and we focused in particular on 2 of those, Karaköy on the one side, and then Cihangir behind, going up the hills. And we realized that over the history of urban development, the Galata Port area has been cut off by a road and also by the steep incline of the hill that's right behind that road. So our focus was, or is, I should say, to develop basically an architectural, cultural, and infrastructural solution that acts as some kind of in-between space between the newly developed port as well as the existing neighborhoods. The neighborhoods are very diverse, so there needs to be a diverse response to the way how we look at that site. So our goal is to make connections, but also articulate separation as well. So we are not interested in only making bridges and connections everywhere, but we want to understand at some point where hard bricks could also be useful for the city. So it's a supercharged and very interesting site historically in terms of infrastructure, but it will also become a very important contemporary beacon of modern day Turkey once it's completed. So that's why we chose that site.
Actually, you just started your Instagram account, some pre-work by your students. It's really fantastic, interesting ideas. I think that they will work that kind of images and hybridization and some solutions, something like that. We really wondered what will be result.
Yeah, there's a certain, I wouldn't call them methodology because it's not as clearly prescriptive, but there's a design approach that I've been developing over the last maybe 3-4 years. Projects that we did also in Cairo have a similar signature. The idea is to think about contemporary design not through means of abstraction, which is a kind of common modernist topic, right? That we abstract legibility to a degree that it becomes universal. And that has been, I would argue, for the last 100 years, a very strong impetus, how quote-unquote contemporary and modern design was thought about. I'm really interested in avoiding abstraction and coming to a novel design expression, a contemporary design expression, by actually being very literal with historical material, infrastructural material, geographical and organic material like parks and trees, etc., and hybridize them in ways to generate these conditions, objects, scenarios, which we then call hybrid, because they truly begin to form a relationship or respond to each other in unexpected ways. This particular studio has another name even. It's called Aachen, which is, I borrowed that term, and it's basically the idea that what we bring together doesn't even have to be harmonious, right? But it's a relationship that is at odds with each other. And, but that tension is something where an opportunity for architecture arises. So the things you mentioned that you see on my Instagram is basically the students studying found objects, quote-unquote architectural objects, as well as infrastructural objects on the site, looking very carefully toward pattern and color and texture, and bringing them into contact with each other in new ways, right? And that's our main approach. And let's see how we will be able to build it up to a larger urban scheme. So the challenge with this type of work is it's one thing to design a building or a smaller object with this idea, and it's a whole other to bring it onto the scale of urban design. So that will be my challenge, and I'm really excited about taking that. By the way, I kept thinking while I was talking, Donna Haraway is the philosopher that coined the term Aachen. So I borrowed that notion from her. I think it's a brilliant word to use as an operational term.
Thank you. So I'd like to start my questions from the education part. How architecture education is organized in the universities like University of Pennsylvania to change and adapt with the upcoming design tools and technologies?
I mean, UPenn has for many years been taking on a leadership role in the way how they deal with technology, or how we deal with technology. I would say the development of the use of technology at an institution like Penn's architecture school has been echoing an overall trajectory of how the leading American schools have been dealing with technology, at least those schools that have a particular interest in design, right? And what I mean by that is that the type of design that is material, formal, structural, textural, right? That the innovation comes through novelty in those material categories, and how can the technology that we use help us to express new kinds of material conditions, right? And so in the early days, it was very strongly based on understanding what the technology can actually do, because the technology itself, the digital technologies that we're talking about, were new. They needed to be tested, they needed to be understood. So often projects looked like the results of playing around with the technology to really understand what they would create. I myself taught digital fabrication courses since 2006 at UPenn, and I know that in the beginning, just the production of a tool was interesting because we saw things that we hadn't seen before. The second phase then became about, all right, what can we now do with the things that we produce? How can we channel them towards architectural questions and problems? And then I would say in the last few years, including today, really, technology has matured to the level that it sinks back into the background, right? It's no longer, at least the way at Penn, the technology is no longer overtly the aesthetic that the projects produce. It's more intricate. Other kinds of motivational design qualities feed into it. Another type of hybridization is happening between technology and other tools of design, as well as an understanding of history and site and place. And that kind of conglomeration or melange is producing, I would say, a lot of the work that you see at Penn. So there has been that sort of evolutionary trajectory of a kind of orthodoxy of the digital being softened up and now generating, I would say, more layered and varied results.
As you know, there's always a gap between architecture education at the universities and the real practice, which puts the students in a very hard situation at the first years of the practice experience. So regarding this issue, what would be your strategies for the education, for an easy adaptations for the students?
That's an interesting question. It's actually one we discussed quite a bit in the United States as well. There are usually two different ways of looking at this. The way you pose the question, it comes from one particular point of view, which is to say that the university or education's main purpose is to prepare the student to have an easy transition into the world of practice. There's a counterposition to that, which is to say that higher education in architecture in particular, postgraduate, post-professional, is supposed to do the opposite, right? It's actually supposed to alert the student to the challenges and the problems of the world, which sometimes includes the practice of architecture, right? So I don't want to make it sound too much like it's a confrontational balance between the academy, let's say, and the practice world, but I'm certainly more on the side of those who like to forge a criticality in the students so that when they go out into the world, they're not too easily absorbed into the existing, right? But they bring with them an ability to be critical and therefore to engender change, right? So an agency of change that comes through the way how we educate them on the highest level. Now, having said that, of course, nobody is served by creating a divide like a wall between the academic world and the practice world, because then they will not cross over. And the practice world will do whatever they do. But I do think that it's a fine line, and we shouldn't just try to produce the perfect employee or even the perfect architectural principle to operate in the practice world. Because a lot of the things that happen in the practice world, of course we all are very much aware of it, are far from ideal, right? They need change. So for us to be able to engender that change, we need to educate students in a way that they ask those kinds of questions. So to me, that is I see my main role as an educator, to instill that type of critical thought in the students. There is no solid block of architectural program. Every architecture program is very different, right? But I feel we need that difference, first of all. I don't think you can have an individual, let's say, universal idea how architectural education should happen. I mean, I'm very aware and familiar with architecture education in the United States and in some countries in Germany and to some countries in Europe, like Germany, for instance, and even in Turkey. They're very, very different for obvious reasons. So it's important to me to understand why a school in a particular context, particular country educates their students in a particular way. Now, if you ask me as a professor at Penn Design, to me, then I would come back to the question and say, yes, I want my students to challenge the status quo rather than prepare them to fit right in.
I'd like to ask about the history of architecture. Because you have talked a lot about the history of architecture. What is the role of history of architecture in today's digital world, and how it is feeding the context of computer-based designs?
Again, I will speak to how I look at it, because this is a very specific question. So I'm not making a larger claim, but other people do. There's a lot of history that we see in this day and age coming back very, very clearly into design expressions. So different people may have different ideas why they do what they do. I myself, I'm interested in history mostly because of what I said early on, trying to avoid abstraction. So if I work on a project and there is a context of that project, which usually, unless you're building somewhere on Mars, you do have some kind of built context. You have to deal with it in some way or another. I'm not a contextualist. My interest is not to say I want to design buildings that fit in. I'm coming from the point of view where I say there's a lot of strange idiosyncrasies everywhere, and I'm interested in those, the things that challenge an easy consumption of architecture. I like things to be difficult, not easy, because I believe when they're difficult, they will force you to spend more time with the thing at hand and try to understand it on a deeper level. It's not so easy to move on and say, okay, this is what it is. So history to me is one of those components. I think history is very complex. If there is historical legibility in some of the designs, it is utilized to express complexity and difficulty. It is by no means meant to just sort of refer to history as the thing that we need to uphold, right? I take a lot of liberties what I do with historical architecture in the context of the projects that we work in. I kind of use them literally like tools, conceptual tools, as well as design tools. So it matters a lot to me. I love history, but again, it's not a historical. I would never want the design that we produce to be misunderstood as some kind of referential architecture or historicist architecture.
Yeah, thank you. When we search about your works, we see that you are designing on a variety of scales. We see a massive science center in Cairo. We see interior designs, and then the scale goes even smaller, like a column designs and etc. What are the benefits of working on different design scales and how it is affecting your design capabilities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also an interesting and kind of a personal question, or the answer will be personal. I think before anything, I probably see myself as a designer, even more than I see myself as an architect. And I don't know when that happened, because I know when I was a student, I wasn't thinking that way. But somewhere along the way, I came to the realization that what matters to me really is to just design stuff, to conceptualize and think about stuff and then design it. And if it takes the form of an object or an art piece or an installation or an interior or an exterior building, small, large, city, to me it's literally just a change in scale, but each one of these challenges is equally interesting and important to me. And I find there is a lateral connection to these kinds of problems. Now, clearly, a small-scale object cannot be translated too easily into a large-scale architecture. You have to think and rethink what it is you're doing according to the scale. But there are certain ideas and principles that can travel, right, or have echoes, right? So we often do something small and then we find an element within that small object which we then translate into a much larger project. Right? A larger project then still is very different, has to act differently, functionally, programmatically, aesthetically, and yet there are these moments that echo another project that we had generated earlier. So that's the main reason, I would say. A secondary reason also is it's a little bit like an exercise. You know, I mean, when you're, I don't know, exercising for a piano piece, there are certain finger exercises you do.
Yes.
Right? So you don't get to build large buildings all the time, right? Or even work on large competition kind of buildings. So the kind of finger exercises to us are often these art type projects, or where the result is not something that you would traditionally call a building. But I like to look at all of it as design/architecture.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You have always mentioned that in the design, the final product is more important than the design process. What are your thoughts on valuing on the final product more than the design process?
There's a really simple answer to that. I mean, at the end of the day, you go home, you're done, and what remains is the final object, final building, final idea, final concept, in whatever state that architecture has expressed itself. That's what we see, that's what other people see, that's what's in the world. I don't believe in a design where an explanation of the process or even an understanding for those who are not producing is an understanding of those of the project has to be based on the process. Right? I think process is very important. I don't think you can do good design without it. You need to know what it is you're doing. You need to be an expert. You need to do it over and over and study, and whatever it is you use in the production of architecture, that process you need to control. The more the better. But it's not something that has to become part of the sort of value of the final outcome.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to ask about parametric design. You have also worked on parametric design and parametric architecture. How would you define it, and what are the most important features that this design tool has?
Well, that's in a way a loaded question, because first of all, it is very difficult to, I feel more comfortable to call it digital design and not parametric design, because parametric design falls into two camps. We either talk about parametricism, which is what Patrick Schumacher is talking about in his books, and he very clearly determines what he thinks parametricism is. And then there's parametric architecture, which is basically design that has been produced with a certain kind of software, which we call parametric software. So there is no particular conceptual or ethical idea connected to parametric design. Parametric design truly is a tool. Parametricism is, I think, as a much larger framework, well defined by Patrick. So if I can change the question a little bit to digital, overtly sort of digital design. When we started in the 1990s, mid-90s, when I was a student and then young practitioner in the late 90s, the digital was just basically this fantastic new tool that came out of nowhere. And we were simply just fortunate as a generation to be at the right time, at the right place. If you were at one of the places that engaged in early digital design. I was at Columbia University, and Columbia University under Bernard Tschumi back then was among the first institutions that really strongly pushed to work with digital tools. I mean, we had the famous or infamous first paperless studios, where the students were asked to design only with a computer, nothing else. I happened to be in one of those first, there were 3. I was in one of those paperless studios run by Greg Lynn. And it felt exciting. It was new. We didn't really know at all what it would yield. It wasn't just going to a studio, having already seen what has been produced and then basically reproducing it. It was truly experimental. And Greg was great that way because he forced us to use software that was not meant for architecture. We were asked to use animation software, which today is a common thing, but back then it wasn't. We used Softimage, and this was before Maya was even on the market. I think Maya came on the market in 98. This is 94. This is fall 94. But it's similar. It's a software that doesn't allow you to just draw lines and extrude them into walls, and you have to work with UV and surfaces. And we were really challenged to understand the geometries that would come from this particular tool, and then ask ourselves what it could do for the discipline of architecture. Now, to me, there's a parametricism in there, but the challenge was not to create a more efficient or more functionalist design. The challenge was, how do you break down pre-existing ideas of what we thought architecture is about with the introduction of a new tool, right? And we often refer to it as some kind of a paradigm shift. I still believe it was a paradigm shift, right? Where it's not only a tool, but a whole way of thinking about the world was altered by the introduction of a certain kind of software. Again, there was, of course, architecture software being already used for more than 10 years in the mid-90s, but it was AutoCAD, MiniCAD, basically computational tools that were mimicking how the architect already draws, right? It was just, we draw like this and then we draw like that in the computer. The big difference with the parametric or parametricist or digital approach was that we didn't mimic how architects worked prior. But we tried to sort of simulate a new kind of architectural realm, one that's, again, based on tools of animation, privileging surfaces and UVs versus XYZ space, moving away from a Cartesian understanding of the world to one of topologies. I mean, these were all major changes that we were thrown into. So to me, it was a wonderful time. Really, we felt like pioneers, but like everything else, there is no endless experimentation with one particular tool. It builds up, it matures, and at some point you ask different kinds of questions with the same tool, right? And then what happened is the experimentation became less, and a new kind of language arose, and which today we can all identify. And we know the architects who do that kind of work. We know how those buildings usually look. So it has become a different kind of animal, if you will. So some of the most recent tendencies to bring in history, and we see a lot of postmodern-like architecture from the young generation coming back. To me, they're all reactions to the trajectory that the digital project has taken over the last 20, 25 years.
Yeah, so thank you. Would you please tell us what is your inspiration in architecture?
Many things. If I'm focusing on architecture itself, which is not the only inspiration, lately I will bring that back to the early part of the interview. Lately, I would say I'm interested in hybridization, I'm interested in misfits and oddkins, I'm interested in idiosyncratic expressions of design. I think that's more a true expression of our contemporary moment, if you will. It seems everything goes on many levels, not only in architecture, but also in art and even in other creative fields. We are not in a time of orthodoxy. We are not in a time of classical modernism, where the avant-garde is collectively pulling on one string. Maybe we had that in the 90s for some time, as I was just mentioning, but right now that one string has unfurled into many, many, many different bits and pieces, and we're pulling sort of still collectively, still knowing where they all come together at some point in history, not that far, not that long ago. But it has become very, very diverse. And as I would say, not only diverse, but idiosyncratic. There are weird and strange and peculiar architectural qualities that we see being expressed by a whole variety of designers. So I look for those, and I also like to look for those in existing and older architectural examples. I mean, one reason why I love coming to Istanbul is I know that in the 19th century there have been a whole set of Ottoman examples of architecture that mix and blend with Baroque, late Baroque elements, Rococo elements, Empire-style elements. All these were considered to be impure at some point in time, and yet there are these fascinating conglomerates of different ideas and different styles, and the way how they come together to create these seemingly ambiguous qualities. That's what I'm the most interested in this day and age.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're valuing the history, you're valuing a lot of things. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thanks for your time. In closing, I would like to ask, what kind of advice would you like to share with young architects?
The simple questions are always the most difficult ones.
Tough question, yes.
Yeah. Particularly if you don't want to sort of give any kind of platitude answer for this type of question. But I would say, given that I do think we are at a time where a lot of different ideas seem to coexist simultaneously, there's basically a lateral way of perceiving the world rather than one that is sort of, let's say, vertical. I would recommend that any young person, an architect, or anybody who's interested really in the field of design needs to do many things really well at the same time. Since, to me, as I also answered in regards to the design question and the scale question, what really matters is how to develop a kind of a longer conceptual idea within which you can build a career. Right? In the old days, Peter Eisenman calls it a project. Right? I mean, what is your project? What are you working on? I don't know if I see it exactly in those terms, but I do agree that it's very important, in order not to get lost in this sort of lateral flood of ideas and images that come up and disappear within minutes, is to find a way of navigation and a way of production and bringing the world of images that is growing constantly to bear into how we manifest form and physicality. Start as early as you can. Right? That would be my advice. Don't just sort of do things quickly without taking your own time to sort of step back a moment and conceptualize the moves you've done so you can build up on them in some kind of way. This building up doesn't have to express itself formally as the same thing. I don't think we can do that anymore. I don't think an architect can basically have a 50-year career with buildings that all look the same. I think that's over with. In this day and age, it will not survive, it will not keep people's attention, and you're not granted any longer as an architect to, you don't have the time to develop that kind of project. Things are too quick. So how do you figure to build sort of consistency in your work in these circumstances is something I don't have an answer for, but it's something I would ask every young architect and architecture student to think about.
Yeah, very helpful, very helpful. Thank you.
All right.
Dear Ferda, thank you so much for such an amazing interview. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this interview. I hope you get the most out of this interview. We're looking forward for more interviews in the future. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button down below, and don't forget to follow our Instagram page. Thank you. Bye.